With only minutes left before his execution, Ruiz Mackenzie made a request no one expected. Not for mercy, not for a final prayer, not even for family. He asked to see his dog. The officers thought he was joking. Men on death row asked for cigarettes, last phone calls, or one last meal. No one had ever asked for a dog. Yet the way Ruiz said it carried a weight that made everyone in the room fall quiet. Something in his voice pressed pause on the routine that was supposed to run like a machine. What happened after that request would interrupt an execution, fracture a sealed conviction, and force an entire prison to face a truth it had buried for years. That morning, the facility felt different. Doors closed more slowly. Footsteps echoed longer. Every sound carried the quiet pressure of something irreversible. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum in a lower pitch, as if the building itself knew this was the final morning of a life. Ruiz sat alone in a holding room, wrists bound, orange fabric pressed flat against his skin. The man who once commanded fear across the streets now waited in silence. The reputation still followed him. Crime lord, killer, ruthless. The world had already decided who he was. Reporters wrote entire articles without ever meeting him. Prosecutors painted him as a monster. The city whispered his name like a warning. But in these last moments, none of that remained. What sat in his chest was not power. It was memory. He thought of the nights when loyalty meant something, of the people who swore they would stand by him, only to disappear the moment the handcuffs closed. He thought of the silence in the courtroom when the guilty verdict was read. Not one friend, not one ally, only Dash, only the dog that never left his side until the arrest forced them apart. If you're enjoying this story, please hit the subscribe button and drop your comments. Dash had been a street stray before Ruiz found him. A shaking, hungry pup hiding under a stairwell near the docks. Everyone else had walked past him. Ruiz didn't. That dog became the one soul that looked at him without judgment. The one creature that believed in him without needing proof. Ruiz lost everything when he went to prison, but losing Dash had cut deepest. This morning, that memory was the only thing keeping him steady. A guard opened the holding room door, expecting to hear a request for a final meal. Ruiz only repeated his earlier words. "I want to see Dash." The guard blinked. "Your dog." Ruiz nodded. Calm, steady, as if the request were the most natural thing in the world. News traveled fast through the processing wing. By the time the request reached the command office, it stalled the room. A dog brought into the yard on execution day had never happened before. Risk assessments were raised. Protocols were cited. Media consequences were outlined. Every supervisor knew they would be questioned about this decision for years. Inside the office, officers studied the paperwork. Ruiz was labeled violent, unpredictable, a former gang leader. Allowing him near an animal could create chaos. But then the warden turned his attention to the live feed from the holding room. There was no anger on Ruiz's face. No performance. No fear. There was only a quiet final need, the kind that could not be faked. For the first time all morning, the warden took a long breath. Then another. Finally, he spoke. 10 minutes. Under strict control. In the yard only. The room froze. But the decision had been made. Back in the corridor, Ruiz was let out of the holding room. The walk felt heavier than before. Lights flickered overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a gate slammed shut, and every guard flinched as if echoed straight through their bones. The prison felt as if it was holding its breath. The execution chamber was already prepared. Witnesses were seated behind the glass. The medical team stood ready. The straps on the table had been checked twice. Everything was in place for the final moments of his life. Ruiz kept his eyes forward. He didn't look at the chamber as they passed it. He focused on each step, steady and unhurried. He had accepted his fate weeks ago, but this one request, this one memory of Dash, had broken something loose inside him. Not hope, just a small human truth he no longer wanted to bury. He was escorted through a metal archway that led toward the outside yard. Morning air seeped through the cracks, cooler than the stale air inside. It brushed the skin and carried the faint smell of cut grass. It was the first natural scent he had breathed in months. Guards tightened their formation around him. One whispered into a radio. Another checked the latch on the gate twice. If Ruiz noticed their nervousness, he gave no sign. Every thought inside him was already far ahead, imagining a brown dog with one torn ear and mismatched eyes, trotting toward him with that familiar wag of the tail. But he also knew this would be the last time. If Dash came through that gate, the memory would have to last him forever. Inside the control booth, the warden waited with a hand resting on the gate release. Officers watched through reinforced glass, unsure what this 10 minutes would bring. The entire facility had shifted from routine to silence. Even inmates in distant blocks had pressed against their doors, sensing something unusual in the air. A guard touched Ruiz's arm lightly. "This is it." Ruiz nodded once. Another guard stepped toward the gate. He placed his key into the lock. Metal scraped, gears turned, and everyone nearby went rigid. No one spoke. No one moved. The moment carried the weight of a verdict. Ruiz watched the far gate, the one that led to the small access road outside. If Dash was really out there, Ruiz would see him first. His heartbeat slowed. His breath steadied. Everything began to narrow, as if the world had shrunk to a single point beyond that fence. All he could think was that Dash had never failed him before. Not once. The warden glanced at the officers, received 2 confirming nods, and finally pressed a button. The far gate began to move. Its heavy frame shuddered, then rolled open inch by inch. Morning light spilled through the widening gap. Shadows stretched across the concrete. Ruiz lifted his head, waiting for the first sign of movement beyond the threshold. He didn't know if his dog would be scared. He didn't know if Dash would even remember him. All he knew was at this moment, these 10 minutes, would be the final memory he carried to the chamber. The gate inched wider. Ruiz held his breath. Something shifted in the light, and the moment froze on the edge of revelation as the gate continued to open. The far gate continued to slide open, metal grinding against concrete, until the gap was wide enough for a single figure to enter. Guards shifted their stance. Radios crackled. The yard, usually loud with inmate shouts and guard orders, fell into a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. A full security lockdown had been ordered for this moment. Spotters stood on the catwalks above with rifles at the ready. 5 armed officers formed a visible perimeter around the center of the yard, their eyes trained on Ruiz. No one understood why the warden had approved this request, but none dared question it now. Ruiz was escorted to a metal bench placed in the exact center of the yard. The concrete beneath him still held the morning chill. A guard checked his cuffs. Another adjusted the chain at his ankles, making sure he could move just enough to kneel, but not enough to run. Ruiz barely noticed. His attention stayed fixed on the widening gap in the far gate. The light beyond it brightened. Then a figure stepped through. A handler in a gray uniform walked forward with a steady pace. And beside him, held by a short black leash, was a brown dog with a torn ear and a tail that flicked in quick, anxious motions. Dash! For a moment, Ruiz forgot how to breathe. Every muscle in his body tightened. Not from fear, but from something deeper, something pulled straight from the years he had spent trying not to think about this dog. His throat closed. His vision blurred. The world narrowed again, just as it had earlier, but now it pulsed with a quiet ache. Dash stopped just inside the yard. His paws hesitated on the concrete. His head turned, scanning the unfamiliar space, tracking the guards, sensing the tension that rippled through the air. Then he lifted his nose. Ruiz did not move. He only watched. Dash sniffed once. Twice. His ears twitched. The tail froze. And in that single suspended second, something old and familiar sparked in the dog's eyes. Recognition. The handler tried to keep walking, but Dash suddenly pulled hard to the side, jerking the leash. The guard holding him stumbled. The dog's body straightened, muscles tightening, breath quickening. Then Dash saw him. The leash slipped. Dash broke free. Before anyone could react, the dog bounded across the yard in a blur of brown fur and flying paws. Chains rattled as Ruiz leaned forward instinctively, hands tugging against his restraints. Guards shouted warnings. A few raised their rifles instinctively, but the warden held up a hand from a control booth. Stand down. Dash reached Ruiz in seconds. The collision knocked Ruiz slightly off balance, the force of the dog's joy overwhelming. Dash pressed his head against Ruiz's chest, paws scraping against a metal bench as he tried to get closer. Ruiz bowed his head until his forehead rested against the dog's fur. His shoulders shook once, not from pain, but from something he had not allowed himself to feel since the verdict was handed down. Dash whimpered, a sound full of relief and longing. Ruiz lifted his bound hands as much as he could and pressed them to the sides of Dash's face. Warm fur, rapid breathing, a heartbeat that raced with frantic happiness. For a moment, the prison disappeared. The guards disappeared. The execution, waiting on the other side of the yard, disappeared. There was only Ruiz and the dog he had raised from a trembling stray to a loyal companion. He remembered the nights Dash slept beside him when Ruiz had nothing but cold floors and colder thoughts. He remembered the day he found the dog bleeding from a street fight and carried him home wrapped in his jacket. He remembered feeding him scraps when Ruiz himself went hungry, choosing to watch the dog eat rather than go to bed with an empty stomach. Dash had been more than a pet. He had been the one constant when every human connection failed. Officials watched from the sidelines with expressions that ranged from discomfort to quiet surprise. No one expected this level of loyalty from a dog. No one expected this level of vulnerability from Ruiz. Dash licked Ruiz's hands, his chin, the top of his sleeve, refusing to let even an inch of space form between them. Ruiz whispered to him, voice thick and low, "Good boy. You remember. You always remember." The dog's tail thumped in quick, uneven beats against Ruiz's leg. Then, suddenly, Dash stopped. His body went still. His ears perked sharply. The tail froze mid-swing. Ruiz felt the shift immediately. He had seen Dash stiffen like that only a handful of times, always in moments when real danger approached. The dog pulled back slightly, nostrils flaring as he scanned the yard. Then his gaze locked onto one of the officers in the perimeter. A low growl rumbled from Dash's chest. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. It vibrated through the air like a warning. The officer he focused on shifted under the weight of that stare. His hand went to his holster. Another guard noticed and raised a rifle slightly, unsure what was happening. Ruiz tried to stroke Dash's back, but the dog barely reacted. His muscles stayed coiled. His eyes did not move from the officer. "Easy," Ruiz whispered. "Dash, look at me. Easy." But the dog did not look away. The growl deepened. The officer flinched and adjusted his stance. Ruiz noticed the way the man swallowed hard. Something about that reaction was wrong. Too nervous. Too reactive. Dash was not a dog who growled without a reason. One of the other guards called out, "Control your animal." Ruiz shook his head. He senses something. Just give him a second. But tension was already rising like a spark creeping toward dry tinder. Weapons were lifted a little higher. Dash's growl edged toward a snarl. The officer shifted again, this time stepping back, one hand still hovering near his weapon. Ruiz narrowed his eyes. He didn't know what Dash had detected, but the dog had never misread danger. "Dash," Ruiz said firmly. "Stay." For a moment, the dog hesitated. His body trembled with the urge to act. Every guard leaned in, waiting to see which direction this moment would break. Then Dash lunged forward again. Not toward Ruiz. Not toward the bench. Straight at the officer, eyes locked with fierce, unshakable certainty. Dash's sudden leap shattered the fragile calm in the yard. Guards reacted instantly. 2 rifles snapped upward. Safeties clicked off, and a tense shout ricocheted through the air. The suspicious officer froze, his eyes widening for the briefest moment before he stepped back, boots scraping sharply across the concrete. "Hold fire," a senior officer barked. He strode in fast, placing himself between Dash and the raised rifles. His voice cut through the panic with practiced authority. "No shots unless ordered. Stand down." The guards obeyed, though their knuckles remained white on their weapons. Dash snarled from Ruiz's side, every part of his body locked toward the officer he'd singled out. Ruiz held the dog's collar as tightly as his cuffs allowed, whispering low to steady him. "Stay with me. It's all right." But Dash did not believe that. His ears were flat, his gaze unblinking, and the growl rumbling from his chest vibrated through Ruiz's hands. The suspicious officer tried to mask his reaction, straightening slowly until his face settled into a stiff, unreadable mask. No anger, no confusion, no fear. His expression was unnaturally controlled, as if he had rehearsed every muscle into place. That alone made Ruiz study him more carefully. Dash pulled again, teeth bared. A second senior officer approached Ruiz, taking small, deliberate steps to avoid provoking the dog. He leaned just close enough to speak, without raising his voice. "Mackenzie, did your dog ever show aggression before?" Ruiz shook his head. "Not like this. Dash doesn't react unless he knows what he's reacting to." The officer nodded as if that confirmed something he already suspected. He lowered his voice further. "That man over there, the one your dog is reacting to, he was on duty the night you were arrested." Ruiz stiffened. "I never saw him." "That's the problem," the officer murmured. "He was there the night of the murder, too." Ruiz turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "In the alley?" The officer didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. "That detail is not in the official record," he finally said. His presence was never logged. A cold ripple spread down Ruiz's spine. His mind flashed back to the night he was framed, the night everything spun out of control. The dark alley, the sound of footsteps running, the shadow he glimpsed for only a second before the police lights flooded in. He had dismissed it as panic, maybe a bystander, maybe a witness who fled. But Dash had been there. Dash had seen the one moment Ruiz hadn't. And now, years later, the dog had recognized that same presence in uniform. Ruiz looked at the officer Dash targeted. The man's gaze had shifted away, but Ruiz could see the tension at the corners of his eyes. The attempt to appear calm was too calculated. Dash growled again, louder this time. The senior officer whispered urgently, "Warden's orders. We are ending the session." Two guards moved in at once, gently but firmly pulling Dash away. The dog resisted, claws scraping at the ground, unwilling to break his stare. Ruiz reached for him as much as the cuffs allowed. "It's okay, Dash. I'm right behind you." The dog whimpered, still fixated on the suspicious officer. It took 3 guards to maneuver him toward the gate. Ruiz's escort stepped beside him and began guiding him back toward the inner entrance. The moment they crossed the threshold into the prison's interior corridor, the atmosphere tightened even further. The silence was sharp and uneasy. Officers exchanged looks they tried to hide, not sure what they had just witnessed, but knowing it mattered more than any of them were prepared for. Ruiz was taken back to a holding room, while Dash was let out of sight. The absence of the dog felt like someone had ripped something warm out of his chest. Only minutes ago, he'd been preparing for his final moments. Now his mind raced with questions he had never allowed himself to imagine answers to. Inside the command office, the warden stood rigidly over a desk as senior staff gathered around him. Their faces looked washed out under the harsh lights. "You will not speak of what happened in the yard," the warden said. "Not a word. Not to anyone outside this room." A lieutenant cleared his throat. "Sir, the witness log from that night. I know what the log says." The warden snapped, "And I know what the dog reacted to." He paused, scanning each person in the room as if weighing the cost of every breath they took. "I am ordering a sealed internal review. Restricted access. Note, digital logs. Hard copies only. This does not leave the building." A ripple of unease moved through the group. The warden's voice lowered. "If what the dog recognized is true, we may be sitting on a conviction with compromised evidence." No one responded. No one dared. Meanwhile, Ruiz waited in silence, staring at the floor, replaying the scene in the yard. Dash never forgot faces. The dog's reaction had not been confusion or fear. It had been certainty. Recognition sharpened into instinct. The officer in the yard had been there the night Ruiz was arrested, and he had not wanted anyone to know. Some distance away, down a dim administrative hallway, the suspicious officer walked briskly toward a locker room. His hands were steady, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He entered the empty room, shut the door behind him, and checked that the hallway was clear. Then he pulled a small private device from his pocket. The screen lit up. He opened a hidden folder. His jaw clenched. Without hesitation, he tapped a single command. Delete. The file disappeared. The deleted file left a quiet tension lingering in the air. Something Ruiz could not see, but somehow felt pressing against the edges of his thoughts. Back in his cell, the silence seemed heavier than usual. Even the hum of the lights felt distant, like the world was shifting around him in ways he could not yet understand. Dash, kept briefly in an isolated kennel before transfer, refused a tray of food placed in front of him. The dog remained alert, ears perked, pacing in a tight circle as if waiting for a threat to reappear. Each time a guard walked past, Dash lifted his head sharply. The handlers exchanged uneasy glances. A dog that loyal did not reject food unless something had shaken him deeply. Ruiz sat on the edge of his bunk, head lowered, hands clasped loosely. The image of Dash growling at the officer replayed in his mind like a scene trapped on loop. It was not random. It was not confusion. It was recognition, sharp and unmistakable. And that thought began to pull loose threads he had spent years burying. He remembered the life he once lived, rising through the underground world faster than anyone expected. He had not built his power on fear alone. Loyalty had been his currency. Every man who served him knew Ruiz never abandoned his own. He rewarded loyalty, protected those who stood with him, and punished betrayal. Those rules had kept order in a world that allowed none. But with power came rivals. One in particular, Adrian Cortez, ruled the Southern Territory and had ambitions far larger than Ruiz's patience allowed. Their tension simmered for months before the night everything collapsed. When Cortez was found murdered in an alley, the city erupted. Allies turned into informants. Rivals smelled opportunity. And Ruiz became the easiest target to blame. His arrest came fast. Too fast. Ruiz still remembered the flashing red lights cutting through the rain, and the way officers swarmed him before he had a chance to understand what was happening. Dash had been there, barking desperately as Ruiz was dragged into a squad car. An officer had shoved the dog aside. Ruiz had shouted for them not to hurt him, but the door slammed shut before he could see what happened next. The trial unfolded like a storm he was powerless to stop. The evidence presented against him seemed airtight. Surveillance images that placed him near the scene. A witness who claimed to have heard his voice. A knife found in a dumpster with traces of blood the prosecution insisted matched Cortez. Every piece fit perfectly, almost too perfectly, but no one questioned it. A man with Ruiz's record was easy to paint as a murderer. The world wanted a villain, and he was offered up as a perfect one. But now, sitting in the dim cell, Ruiz felt a slow, unsettling shift inside him. The officer Dash growled at, the unrecorded presence at the scene, the way the warden ordered a sealed review. Pieces of a puzzle he had never imagined began to tilt into place. Meanwhile, in a quiet administrative wing of the prison, two investigators sat at a conference table with a reopened case file spread before them. They had been chosen by the warden for their discretion and sharp instincts. He trusted neither easily. I went through the arrest log again. One said, flipping through sheets. The officer Dash recognized wasn't listed anywhere that night. The second investigator frowned. That's impossible. There were tight protocols in place. No one was supposed to be on scene unless assigned. Exactly. They exchanged a look that carried a dozen silent questions. What about surveillance? The second asked. The first investigator tapped a screen displaying grainy footage. This section of video from the alley, it cuts out for 28 minutes. That wasn't in the trial record. I know. And no one asked why a major camera in a high crime zone went dark. Apparently not. A cold realization crept into the room. The gaps weren't subtle. They were glaring. Missing footage. Overly convenient evidence. An officer who had been exactly where he should not have been. The case had been clean. Too clean. The investigator leaned back, rubbing his forehead. If that officer was involved off record, this whole conviction could be compromised. Or orchestrated. The other replied quietly. A silence settled between them. The kind that comes when truth begins to scratch its way through years of accepted lies. Dash, meanwhile, remained restless, pacing back and forth as if waiting for someone he needed to protect. Every time a guard approached his kennel, the dog stiffened, then relaxed only when the steps passed. Ruiz pressed his palms together, breathing slowly as the pieces continued forming a shape he had been afraid to consider. The idea had lingered once, years ago, when everything first fell apart, a small suspicion buried under the weight of anger and exhaustion. But now the possibility returned with sharper edges. What if he had never been meant to survive the trial? What if he wasn't the one who killed Cortez? What if someone had framed him from the start? The thought settled not as a spark of hope, but as a quiet, steady truth he could no longer push away. Far from the prison, in a run-down neighborhood on the edge of the city, a woman stared at her phone with shaking hands. She had watched the morning broadcast, the one showing the prison yard from a distance. The reporter mentioned a disruption, a delay in the execution, a dog brought in for a final request. The woman recognized that dog instantly, and she recognized Officer Dash attacked. Her pulse hammered as she replayed the footage again and again, each time more terrified of what she now remembered. She grabbed her coat, stepped out of her small apartment, and hurried toward the street. Her voice trembled as she dialed the emergency number. When the dispatcher answered, the woman took a breath she barely managed to hold steady. "I need protection," she said. Immediately, she looked back over her shoulder, terrified someone might already be watching. "I know something about the murder Ruiz Mackenzie was convicted for." For hours after the emergency call, the precinct felt like it was holding its breath. The air shifted, sharp, expectant, like the moment before a fuse meets flame. Ruiz remained in his cell, sitting on the bench with his hands folded loosely, a strange calm over him. He didn't know yet, not fully, not what the call meant, not how close the truth finally was. But Dash did. He'd heard the whispered message, the civilian who needed protection, the urgency, the trembling voice, and every instinct in him said, "This is a thread everything depends on." The witness arrived just after midnight, a man in his early 40s, hollow-eyed, drenched in cold sweat despite the humid air. His hands shook as he clutched the straps of an old backpack, as if letting go of it would make him fall apart. 2 officers escorted him in, but he flinched each time one stepped too close. Trauma had carved permanent reflexes into his bones. He didn't sit when asked. He hovered, as though still halfway between fleeing and collapsing. Detective Lien began gently, "State your name for the record." The man swallowed, Adam's apple jerking. "Julian Cross." Dash typed the name into the file. No hits, no priors, no reason for this man to be connected to one of the most notorious murder cases in state history. Unless he really was what he said. The missing witness. Lien kept her voice steady. "You said you were present the night of the Beckett murder. Tell us what you saw." Julian's breathing turned ragged. He didn't look at anyone, only at the floor. I shouldn't be here," he whispered. "I told myself I'd stay out of this forever, but I couldn't sleep anymore. I kept seeing him every night." The officer. Dash's head snapped up. Officer. Not man. Not killer. Not suspect. Officer. Julian clenched the straps of his backpack until his knuckles went white. "The night Beckett died, I was leaving my shift at the maintenance tunnels. I heard shouting in the alley behind the warehouse. I thought it was just drunks." He shook his head quickly. "But then I heard someone beg. A man begging for his life." Lien leaned forward. "And you went to look?" "I shouldn't have," Julian whispered. "But it was instinct. And when I got there, Beckett was already down. Blood everywhere. And someone stepped out of the back in trance." His voice broke. It wasn't Ruiz. The words hit the room like a dropped match. Dash didn't blink. Lien didn't breathe. Julian forced himself to keep talking. It was an officer. Full uniform. Badge. Holster. I saw him pull his gloves off and shove something inside his jacket. He didn't even look at Beckett. He just walked out like he'd finished paperwork. Dash's pulse thudded once, heavy and slow. "You're sure it was a police officer?" Lien asked, steady but low. Julian nodded. "I saw the badge number. Clear as day. 8-1-3-2. I memorized it because he saw me. Dash felt his stomach sink. If Julian saw the officer, then the officer saw Julian survive. Julian's voice dropped to a whisper. He stared at me. Then he said, "Turn around and forget this." And I did. Shame thickened his voice. I ran and didn't stop. Dash typed the badge number. His fingers froze. The match flashed on the screen in bold letters. Officer Paul Rennick. Same name that had surfaced in the old evidence files. Same unexplained timestamp gaps. Same officer who had testified aggressively at the original trial, insisting he saw Ruiz near the scene. Leanne looked at the screen. Her jaw tightened. "We'll need your statement signed," she said, "and we'll verify everything." Julian's breathing quickened. I didn't come here for revenge. I just couldn't keep living like this. I'm not brave. I just couldn't keep seeing that officer walking free while that man, he gestured toward the holding area, waited to die. Dash studied him. This trembling man who'd held 7 years of truth inside him like a rotting secret. "When's the last time you told anyone what you saw?" Dash asked. "Never." Julian shook his head violently. "I tried once. Typed it into an anonymous report, but I panicked and deleted it. I knew what it meant, not just for him," he nodded toward Ruiz, "but for me, if that officer finds out I talked." Leanne looked him straight in the eye. "He won't." Julian laughed softly, broken. Detective, men like him always know. Within the hour, the investigation team verified the badge number. Timestamps matched. Rennick's location logs placed him near the warehouse at the exact window of the murder. And Ruiz, his alibi, once dismissed as fabricated, finally began to align with the timeline in a way that made sense. Dash didn't want to be the one to tell Ruiz, but he also didn't want anyone else to. He walked back into the holding area, unlocking the door with a silent exhale. Ruiz looked up from the bench, eyes sharper than they'd been all night. "Something changed," Ruiz said quietly. Not a question. Dash nodded once. A witness came forward. Someone who saw part of what happened the night Beckett died. Ruiz's breath hitched, not with hope, but with something more jagged, more dangerous. What did he say? Dash studied him a moment. Not the legend, not the ghost the city feared. Just a man who had been waiting for a truth that no one had bothered to look for. He saw an officer leaving the scene, Dash said, and he confirmed you weren't there. For a man as controlled as Ruiz, the reaction was staggering. His eyes closed. His chest rose and fell once, unsteady. The faintest flicker of disbelief crossed his face before shifting into something harder, pain, then anger, then a quiet, terrible clarity. "They framed me," Ruiz murmured. Dash didn't confirm it. Not yet, but the silence between them was enough. A few minutes later, word came down from the warden. Execution on hold pending immediate review. It was a single sentence, but it cracked open the night. The precinct erupted into frantic motion. Calls to the DA's office, emergency filings, rapid reevaluation of every piece of evidence that once condemned Ruiz. But in an office on the second floor, another reaction unfolded. Officer Paul Rennick sat alone, staring at the alert on his screen, the color draining from his face. A witness, a badge number, an old case reopened. He stood abruptly. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't look at anyone. He headed for the restricted exit, fast. Dash was the first to spot the movement on camera, and his blood ran cold. "Officer Rennick is trying to leave the facility," he said, pushing back from the monitor. Leanne's head snapped up. "What? We're in lockdown. He can't." "He's doing it anyway." An alarm began to pulse overhead. Slow at first, then accelerating as the system recognized an unauthorized breach attempt. Dash bolted for stairs. Behind him, the entire building lurched into motion. But one thought beat louder than the alarms, the footsteps, the shouts. Rennick wasn't just running. He was running because of what he'd done. And a man running from the truth was always the most dangerous kind. The alarm still throbbed to the corridors when Dash reached the lower level. Rennick had made it halfway to the restricted exit before 2 security officers intercepted him, slamming him against the reinforced door with enough force to rattle the frame. The officer didn't fight back He just sagged, breathing hard, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Dash arrived just as they cuffed him. Rennick's head snapped up when he saw him. For the briefest second, fear flickered in his eyes, not the fear of being caught, but the fear of being seen for what he truly was. "Where were you going, officer?" Dash said, voice low and sharp. Rennick opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The truth was already suffocating him. They dragged him to interrogation room 2. No windows, no soft corners, just concrete, steel, and the steady floodlight overhead. The door locked with a metallic thud that echoed down the hall. Detective Lien entered with a tablet full of documents. Dash stood behind her, arms crossed, trying to keep his breathing steady. Rennick sat at the table, pale, sweating, hands shaking in their cuffs. "Officer Paul Rennick," Lien began, "you attempted to exit a secure facility during lockdown. Before we continue, is there anything you'd like to say?" Rennick's jaw trembled. I panicked. You know how tense things are tonight. I just wanted air." Dash stepped forward slightly. "You tried to bypass a locked exit. That's not air, Rennick. That's flight." Lien set the tablet on the table. "Let's start with a badge timestamp from the Beckett murder night," she said. "Your patrol log says you were on the opposite side of the district." Rennick closed his eyes. "But surveillance shows your cruiser 2 blocks from the warehouse at the exact time of the murder." He opened them again, wild, unfocused. "That timestamp, it's wrong. Could be a glitch." "It's not a glitch," Dash cut in. 3 independent logs confirm it. Rennick swallowed hard, his hands clenched. "And then there's the witness," Lien continued, "who saw you exiting the warehouse." Rennick's voice snapped up an octave. "He's lying. Whoever he is, he's mistaken." "He gave your badge number," Lien said, "digit for digit." A long, dreadful silence stretched. Dash watched Rennick unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a man whose lies had been the beams holding the ceiling above him. And now those beams were crumbling. Lien tapped another file open. "We reviewed your financials." Rennick stiffened. "You've received deposits," she said, "unconnected to your salary. Large ones." "Investments," Rennick whispered. "From offshore accounts tied to Beckett's rival cartel leader," she finished. The room tilted then, emotionally, atmospherically. Even the light seemed harsher. Rennick looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I don't know anything about that account," he muttered. Dash leaned forward. "You think we're stupid?" Rennick didn't answer. Lien kept going. "Payment records show regular transfers starting 2 months before Beckett's death." She paused. "And a final, much larger payment 2 days after Ruiz was arrested." Dash watched something collapse inside Rennick's eyes. A private, irreversible implosion. Lien lowered her voice. "Tell us about your connection to Carlo Varelli." Rennick's lips pressed together. Silence. But his silence was louder than any confession. 2 hours into the interrogation, the narrative had shifted fully. Every contradiction Rennick offered snapped under the pressure of documented fact. Every excuse he tried to form wilted the moment Lien slid another file across the table. Every denial made his knees bounce faster, shoulders curl tighter, voice grow thinner. It wasn't just guilt. It was terror. Betting against the truth had finally cornered him. Meanwhile, Ruiz sat in a small observation room, hands folded on the table beside him, behind the one-way glass. He watched Rennick with no satisfaction, no triumph, no anger, only the low burn of vindication long delayed. Dash entered briefly, standing beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When the interrogation paused for a break, officers escorted Rennick out of the room, shackled, head down, chest heaving. Dash met them in the hallway. The moment Rennick passed, something in Dash snapped. All the tension from the long night surged upward, every injustice, every lie, every year Ruiz had spent in a cage. Dash stepped forward before anyone could stop him. "You framed him," Dash said, face inches from Rennick's. "You watched an innocent man go to death row. You let a family fall apart. You destroyed lives." Rennick tried to turn away, but Dash caught his shoulder hard. "Say it," Dash growled. "Dash." Lien's voice cut sharply behind him. He froze. Two officers stepped between them, pulling Rennick back. Dash exhaled shakily, jaw tight, pulse pounding in his ears. Rennick staggered past, refusing to lift his gaze. In the observation room, Ruiz had risen. He watched Dash through the glass, expression unreadable, something complex moving behind his eyes. A strange intersection of protectiveness, disbelief, and the faintest hint of gratitude he'd never voice. Then the door locked again, separating them. By dawn, the corruption web was no longer speculation. It was clear structure. Rennick's connection to Varelli was established. His payments were traceable. His proximity to Beckett at the time of death was undeniable. And the motive? Simple. Varelli wanted Beckett eliminated and Ruiz blamed. Because Ruiz had done something dangerous in their world. He refused money, refused bribes, refused to look the other way. In the criminal underworld, refusing corruption was a declaration of independence, and independence made you a threat. Ruiz had been framed not because he was dirty, but because he wasn't dirty enough to control. The truth hit like a revelation wrapped in irony. Dash stared at the evidence file for a long moment, struggling with what it meant for everything he thought he knew. Ruiz wasn't clean, but he wasn't this. He hadn't killed Beckett. He hadn't taken the money. He hadn't bent to Varelli. The frame job was no longer a theory. It was a blueprint, and every page pointed straight at Rennick. At 8 a.m., a technician rushed in with a sealed container. "Emergency priority," she announced. Fingerprint and DNA sample from the weapon recovered in the old evidence lockup. Dash turned sharply. "What?" "We found a sample on the inner grip," she said. "It's degraded, but still viable. Lab's prepping it now." Leanne exchanged a look with Dash. "If this matches Rennick," she murmured, "it ends everything." Dash nodded slowly, adrenaline tightening in his chest. Ruiz's gaze from across the hallway inside his holding cell followed the technicians with silent intensity, sensing the weight of the moment even without hearing the details. For the first time in 7 years, the world was tilting toward the truth. As the tech hurried the container down the corridor toward the lab, Dash whispered, "Run the test. Run it now. No delays." The technician nodded and disappeared behind the lab door. The lock clicked. The machine spun up. The truth, cold, scientific, undeniable, was finally on its way to the surface. The lab door opened just after sunrise. The technician held a seal folded to her chest, her face tight with the strain of knowing her next words would change lives. Dash and Detective Leanne stepped toward her, neither breathing. "It's confirmed," she said quietly. "The DNA from the murder weapon matches Officer Paul Rennick." The hallway didn't move for several seconds. It simply existed in suspended silence, holding the weight of 7 lost years in the air. Then Dash closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as the truth settled into place. The foundation of the entire case shifted. No more speculation. No more doubt. No more technicalities or shadows. It was official. Rennick had been at the crime scene with the weapon. The warden assembled senior staff in the administrative briefing room within the hour. Screens flickered on with evidence charts, transaction trails, badge logs, call records, and finally, the DNA confirmation. A corruption network that once lived in the dark now glowed under the fluorescent lights. The room was filled with stiff faces and shaking heads. Some officers stared at the screens in disbelief. Others rubbed their foreheads as weight settled across their conscience. A few couldn't even look, knowing their silence over the years made them part of the problem. Rennick was brought in under full restraints. His expression was blank, almost hollow, as the warden read through the findings. For the first time, there was no room for denial, no place to hide, no version of his story left intact. "You framed an innocent man," the warden said. "You murdered Beckett under the direction of Carlo Varelli, and you manipulated the investigation to ensure Mr. Mackenzie took the fall." Rennick didn't answer. His shoulders slumped like a wall, finally giving way to gravity. Charges were drafted on the spot. Murder, evidence tampering, corruption, conspiracy, abuse of authority. Every count delivered like a nail sealing a coffin. Dash watched with an expression that carried both fury and a strange, exhausted relief. The monster that had shaped Ruiz's fate was no longer a rumor. He was a prisoner in chains. By mid-morning, news vans crowded outside the facility. Reporters shouted into microphones while cameras rolled nonstop. The story had traveled faster than anyone expected. Death row inmate cleared by DNA. Officer arrested in connection to high-profile murder. Corruption ring exposed. The front gates buzzed with lights and voices. A storm of the world waking up to the truth Ruiz had lived with for years. Inside, Ruiz sat alone in a transition cell. The heavy air of death row was gone, replaced with the echo of footsteps belonging to staff he had never seen before. His orange uniform felt heavier now, as if the fabric remembered everything he had endured. A guard entered quietly. "Mackenzie, you're being moved." Ruiz looked up slowly. Moved where? Out of death row. Permanently. The words landed like a shockwave. He stood after a moment, rising as if carrying years on his back. The guard uncuffed him from the floor restraints and guided him through a wing he had never been allowed to step inside. As they walked, Ruiz noticed how different the air felt, how the light seemed brighter, how this corridor hummed with the rhythm of life instead of endings. He had prepared himself to die for so long that the idea of freedom felt unreal, almost dangerous. The transition unit was quiet. A medical officer checked his vitals. A legal team assembled documents. Someone offered him water. Ruiz held the bottle for a long time before drinking, almost as if he had forgotten the subtle choices of everyday life. Then a door opened behind him. Dash stepped in. 2 officers remained on either side, but they didn't speak. They simply allowed the moment. Ruiz's breath caught in his throat. Dash approached slowly. As if unsure whether Ruiz was real or a ghost, he followed through a maze of dark rooms and impossible nights. When he reached him, he didn't speak at first. He just stood there, taking in a man who had survived a fate already sealed for him. Ruiz stared back, unable to disguise the disbelief shaping his face. "They told me," Dash whispered. Ruiz nodded, voice low. "So it's real. It's real." Silence stretched between them, not the cold kind. The kind that carries the weight of everything that almost happened. Ruiz looked down for a moment. "All this time," he said quietly, "I thought death was the only ending left for me." "You're walking out," Dash answered. "Not today, but soon. You're walking out." The words settled into Ruiz's bones. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply absorbed them with a depth that shook something inside him back to life. Their supervised minutes passed, but neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The truth sat in the room with them, finally uncloaked. That afternoon, a legal officer set a stack of papers on the table in front of Ruiz. "These are your clearance documents," she said. "Recorded officially. The state acknowledges you were wrongfully convicted. Your execution order is void. Formal release procedures are beginning." Ruiz stared at the papers. His name, his case number, his innocence, written plainly where once there had been accusation and finality. The pen felt unfamiliar in his hand. Years of isolation made the simple act of signing his own fate feel surreal. Dash stood in the doorway, watching from a respectful distance as Ruiz took his time. Outside, the media continued to roar. Staff moved with urgent purpose. The prison itself seemed to shift under the weight of a story too large to contain. Ruiz lowered the pen to the page. His hand trembled once. Then he signed. The pen left the paper, and for a long moment, Ruiz simply stared at his signature. It looked like the handwriting of a stranger. The legal officer collected the documents, thanked him, and stepped out. The door clicked shut, leaving him alone with the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant echo of reporters shouting outside the walls. For years, Ruiz Mackenzie had lived in a cage with death as his only certainty. Now freedom waited on the other side of a gate. The simple truth felt heavier than any sentence he had ever carried. He leaned back in the chair and let his breathing settle. The man he used to be drifted toward him like a shadow from an old life. Once, people ran when they heard his name. He had built an empire from nothing, fought his way through the ranks with fists, fire, and fear. He had acted like consequences were for weaker men. His pride had been armor, his reputation a weapon. He paid for it in ways he never imagined. Sitting in the transition room, Ruiz saw the trail behind him clearly. The rivals he crushed, the alliances he forced, the choices that stained more lives than he ever acknowledged. Even now, part of the world would always see him as a criminal he had once been. In some ways, they were not wrong. His past had carved scars across too many people for truth alone to wipe clean. The injustice of his conviction did not erase the damage he had done long before that night. And as he stared at the blank wall in front of him, he accepted a quiet reality. Freedom would not make him innocent. It would only make him responsible for what came next. Minutes drifted by until a guard finally knocked and stepped inside. "Mackenzie," he said, "they're preparing the release yard. You'll be moved soon." Ruiz stood slowly. The chains were gone now, but instinct still made his shoulders tense, as if metal held him down. The guard guided him through a side corridor where a small team of officials waited. One handed him a packet of civilian clothes. "Change when you're ready. You'll get back the uniform before you exit." Ruiz took the clothes, running his fingers over the fabric. Soft, clean, nothing like the stiff, stinging material he had worn for years. He entered a small private room to change, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He barely recognized a man looking back. His hair had grown uneven. His eyes were sharper yet quieter. Lines shaped by waiting and loss framed his face. Prison had taken many things, but it had given him clarity in return. He slipped into the new clothes, folded the orange uniform, and stepped out. A passing officer paused. "Never thought I'd see this day," he muttered. Ruiz didn't answer. He had no space left for bitterness. The world had given him worse than silence, and he had survived it. The hallway leading to the release wing buzzed with activity. Media vans outside were broadcasting nonstop. Even from within the facility, he could hear muffled shouting. Reporters shouting his name. Commentators debating his past. People demanding answers. It hit him with quiet force. Freedom might come, but forgiveness would not follow. His reputation would always precede him, even if the charges were gone. The world will remember the crime lord first, the injustice second, and the truth somewhere far behind. He exhaled, steadying himself. "Ruiz," a voice said from behind. He turned. Dash stood there, hands in his pockets, expression controlled but warm in a way Ruiz had not seen in years. Two officers stayed nearby, giving them space without granting them privacy. "Release protocol allows you a short supervised moment," one guard said. Dash stepped closer. "You did it," he said quietly. Ruiz shook his head. "You did it. All of you." "Maybe," Dash replied, "but you're the one walking out of those gates." Ruiz studied him. Dash had not betrayed him. Not once. Not during the rise. Not during the fall. Not during the years when Ruiz himself had accepted the idea of dying alone. Loyalty like that didn't exist in the world he came from. And perhaps that was why Dash had become something more than an ally. He was the only constant in a world built on shifting loyalties. Ruiz lowered his voice. "When this is over," he said, "I don't know who I'm supposed to be." "Then we figure out," Dash answered, "one day at a time." Ruiz nodded slowly. He could feel the truth in those words. The man who once ruled the streets had been stripped down to bone and memory, rebuilt by silence and time. Whatever came next, he would face it without the iron mask he wanted behind. Officers signaled that the moment was over. Dash stepped back as Ruiz was led toward a reinforced corridor painted with a single message above the exit: property of the state until released. He walked beneath the sign with a steady pace. For the first time in years, he had no cuffs on his wrists, no chains dragging at his ankles, no escort forcing him to match their steps. He moved on his own. The corridor opened into a waiting yard divided by metal barriers. Several administrators checked documents. A final clearance officer compared Ruiz's signature to earlier paperwork. "All records completed," she said. "You will exit shortly." Ruiz inhaled slowly. The cold air filled his lungs with a sting he hadn't felt in a long time. A guard at the far end spoke into a radio. Prepare the outer gate. The metal machinery groaned in response. Ruiz turned his head slightly and found Dash watching from behind the barrier. They didn't speak, but the understanding between them was solid. Whatever he faced outside, he wouldn't face it alone. Wind swept through the yard as the last officer stepped back. Ruiz lifted his chin, and then the heavy mechanism began to move. Steel shifted, gears locked into place. Light spilled through the widening gap. The outer gates groaned as they slid open, metal dragging against metal, and the sound struck Ruiz like a final verdict. For years he had imagined this moment in 100 different shapes and colors. In all of them, he walked out a ghost. In all of them, no one waited. But reality did not care about his rehearsed endings. Sunlight spilled across the concrete, like something alive. It hit his face first, warm, clean, unfamiliar, and he flinched instinctively, raising a hand to shield his eyes. He wasn't used to brightness. He wasn't used to anything that didn't hum with fluorescent buzzing or reek of disinfectant and steel. "Keep walking," an officer murmured behind him. Not hostile, not friendly, just someone doing a job, making sure the man who had been almost executed did not stop and break down in the doorway. Ruiz forced his feet forward. 4 steps out. 6. By the 10th, he could see beyond the double fence line, past the press barricades, past the officers assigned to keep cameras from crossing the threshold. A wall of noise rose from them. Shouts, accusations, questions, the metallic clatter of equipment, but all blurred into a single distant buzz. Because there, sitting just past the outer security tape, was Dash. The dog sat rigid and trembling, handler at his side, ears perked so high they almost touched. And when Ruiz's silhouette broke fully into view, Dash let out a sound Ruiz had never heard from him, a strained, high whine that carried straight across the yard. Ruiz stopped walking. His chest folded in on itself. He had pictured this too, but none of his versions had captured the truth of it. Dash wasn't wagging, wasn't bounding forward. He sat frozen, eyes locked on Ruiz like he was afraid to blink and lose him again. Ruiz swallowed hard and moved. Every step felt like dragging through memories, through concrete floors and cell doors, through years of shutting himself down, through months of preparing to die. But something in his stride loosened as the distance shrank. One fence, then the second, then the final chain-link barrier that separated him from the world. The handler unclipped the leash. Dash didn't run. He launched. All muscle, all desperation, all heart. He slammed into Ruiz with force that nearly knocked him off his feet, paws scraping against his chest, nose pushing under his chin, whining and snorting and bearing into the curve of his neck as if trying to climb inside his heartbeat. Ruiz dropped to his knees. He didn't mean to, but the ground rose fast beneath him, and Dash's warmth held him upright when his legs couldn't. The first sob hit him so suddenly he choked on it. He cupped Dash's head in both hands, fingers trembling as he held the dog close. Dash licked at his jaw, his cheek, the corner of his mouth, frantic and relieved all at once. "It's all right," Ruiz whispered, words breaking apart. "I'm here. I'm still here." The cameras didn't matter. The reporters circling like sharks didn't matter. The voices screaming about injustice or corruption or murder didn't matter. This single trembling reunion in the sunlight was the only moment he had wanted back, the only moment he had begged God for, long after he had stopped believing God listened to men like him. He pressed his forehead to Dash's and let himself break. For a long time, neither of them moved. Ruiz felt the weight of the world empty out of him in shuddering breaths. Years of holding himself together unspooled in seconds. Spilling out in a flood, he had been too proud to show anyone else. But Dash stayed, shoulder braced against Ruiz's chest, tail wagging in slow, steady arcs like he was anchoring him to the ground. Eventually, an officer stepped closer, speaking gently. "We need to clear the area." Ruiz wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed only for a moment before he remembered no one's opinion could touch him anymore. Not after surviving everything he had survived. Not after losing and regaining the only creature who had seen him as something other than a monster. He stood carefully, keeping a hand on Dash's neck, as if afraid the dog would vanish if he let go. The press surged, shouting questions so loud they pierced through the haze. Do you have anything to say to the victim's family? Are you going to sue the department? Do you deny your past involvement with organized crime? Mr. Ruiz, are you still dangerous? He didn't answer. He didn't know them pieces of himself. Dash pressed into his leg, guiding him forward, and Ruiz followed without looking at the chaos around him. The handlers gave them space. The officers formed a loose boundary, unsure whether to protect Ruiz or the reporters from each other. Public opinion was split straight down the center. Some faces looked furious, betrayed, certain that a killer had been freed. Others looked shell-shocked, moved by the dog's reaction, by the humanity of the moment. A few even clapped quietly. But none of that changed his reality. He walked out of that prison without an entourage. No one from the old days was waiting. No empire stood ready to reclaim him. He had burned all of that long ago, and the world had not forgotten who he used to be. Freedom, he realized, was not a reset. It was a burden with no owner's manual. Dash trotted close at his heel as they moved toward the transport van assigned to take him to temporary housing. His new life had not been planned for glory. It had been designed for caution, for anonymity, for safety. Someone clear to murder was not automatically clear of the shadows that had trailed him for decades. A few reporters tried to push forward one last time. Ruiz, what happens now? He stopped, not for them, but because the question hit harder than he expected. What happens now? He looked down at Dash, who stared back with warm eyes and a patience that never once faltered during months of separation. What happens now is simple, Ruiz thought. He chooses a life where he never loses his dog again. He chooses quiet, however foreign it feels. He chooses to learn how to breathe without counting down the hours. He chooses to live without chains, even if the world never lets him forget they once held him. He rested a hand on Dash's head. We start over, he said softly, mostly to himself. Dash leaned into his palm. As they approached the waiting van, Ruiz paused at the base of the steps. The prison gates clanged shut behind them, echoing like a closing chapter written too late, but finally finished. He turned one last time toward the structure that had nearly taken everything from him. Then he looked forward again. Forward was what mattered. He climbed inside with Dash hopping eagerly at his side. The door shut. The engine rumbled. The world outside blurred into a smear of color through the tinted windows. Ruiz exhaled, slow and steady, absorbing the truth settling in his bones. He had no power left, no crew, no throne, but he had the one soul who never abandoned him, not even when the needle was prepped and the countdown had begun. Loyalty, he realized, wasn't proven in the days of strength. It was revealed in the moments of ruin. Dash rested his head on Ruiz's knee, and Ruiz placed his hand gently on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of each breath. Truth had set him free, but loyalty, the kind that never let go, gave him somewhere to go. And as the van rolled away from the place that once defined him, Ruiz allowed himself to believe, for the first time in years, that he could become someone new,